Right, I think we've got, yeah, we have numbers at the table. Who's coming forward on this one? Sorry.
We're just going to do that, accepting electronic attendance.
Ah, right.
So we'll just do,
Kia ora. Could I please have order in the court? Right, we have Councillor Sayers has had to leave and he's asked for us to accept his electronic attendance. I have specifically asked if he is driving, he cannot be on the attend, but he's on the bus. So while at the period he's on the bus, he can be in the meeting, but driving is not a appropriate to be on the meeting and concentrating at the same time. Can I have I've got a mover and a seconder, myself and Councillor Dalton. All those in favour? Any opposed? Cool, thank you. Right, we are going now to item 8, reporting back on the scope of work, the recent flooding impacts, implications and improvements.
do you know something?
Yeah, and so also added some chairs as this morning, about 45 minutes before, half an hour before the meeting, Mayor and some others contacted me about some concerns that we'd already been discussing around Plan Change 28. So I'll move in. What did I say?
28.
Oh, I said 70. Maybe I just need to not. I need to enunciate Plan Change 78. So I'll move, and the Mayor is going to second, and we can talk about that after the. Are we going? Is Katarina, John, and Jacques coming? Megan, are there? Sorry. Is it just Katarina?
And John.
And John. Thank you.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, our timing is slightly off. So Katarina and John are just here. So this is, as you said, the approval was provided in between the last committee meeting and today. We've reported this back as we've promised to do. So Katarina and John will do just a quick intro and answer any questions. But it's not a decision as such on the scope that's been done. The chair has put some additional recommendations as well for your consideration. Kia ora, Kat.
So yeah, so there isn't a presentation as such, but the officers are here to answer questions on the scope. Myself, Councillor Dalton, Member Ashby and the Mayor have approved the scope as was suggested last meeting. This is to try and get it moving quickly. Obviously, it's really important that we get this work underway. Plan Change 78 is a part of our work on this, but we wanted to define and make sure that we were clear about the parts of that were going to be considered and looked at. So if there are questions on this, Councillor Darby.
So can we just pose a question on the D? Is it appropriate now?
Yes.
Yeah. Can Chief of Staff or GM Planning just explain to us, are there any implications with that? I'm just cognizant of the back end of the process and the pressure that's going to be on the back end of the process, and there is a drop dead date. So just want to be confident that we can do that work and meet that drop dead date.
Kia ora through Chair, happy to answer that. So that is the drop dead date that we're talking about. So at the moment, the Minister requires the Independent Hearings Panel to notify their recommendations by March 2024. That's the timeline that we are, that is suggested in D to request an extension for. So that is that deadline that you're talking about, Councillor Darby.
That's clear, it's that date. Have we made any soundings of the Minister's office on this to date?
Through the Chair, I haven't, but the Mayor possibly.
I talk regularly with the Minister and I'm quite happy to take this and twist his arm.
Speaking from chair point of view, I do have, concerns about what this could mean. We have to realise that, there has been calls to delay or cancel the whole thing. We do not have the ability to do that. We do run the risk, if we do not get some of this approved, that we actually won't have enough evidence in time to defend our qualifying matters, which are actually very good on floodplains, hazards, coastal erosion. So it's a balance to make sure that we are ensuring that our officers have enough information quickly, and so we're hoping that through the hearings panel they will consider the natural hazards, stormwater management, floodplains at the later stages of the hearings, and that would help us and help staff have that robust information post floods. Councillor Walker.
I've got a couple of questions. The first one goes to prioritisation. There's a scope of works. The scope of works are quite expansive. Having said that, we know that we need to act now in terms of providing information to this process, informing the commissioners about the recent impacts of the floods. So my question goes to prioritisation. Can we apply as much resource to that as we can? And the background to that you might want to comment on is, if we do not do that, and Plan Change 78 goes through in its current form, the risk to council, the financial effects, the impact on the community in terms of private property and our property will be catastrophic over time. And I'm assuming that we're factoring that in respect of prioritisation. So my first question is around prioritisation and the need for speed, because obviously we work in the deadlines. Thank you.
Chair, I'll respond to that. So paragraph 53 does talk about reviewing our approach to Plan Change 78, and that's obviously picked up in the amendments here. It's critical that we do factor in the recent events and all of the information that we can obtain before we get into mediation and hearings on matters relating to hazards under Plan Change 78. In terms of resource, the report does note that there may be resource implications, but we will certainly be prioritising as best we possibly can within our resources to make sure we gather the information and make sure we have a really sound approach to Plan Change 78. I think that's the best I can say there.
The second question I've got goes to the nature of the information that we provide to inform the hearings panel. My question is it possible for us to inform them about the direct effects that people have suffered? To illustrate by way of specific examples within specific catchments, to provide video evidence that is graphic, to actually provide some information that will enable them to comprehend as realistically as they can the nature of what has happened, which is one of the worst events that Auckland has experienced. So can we provide that sort of information? Is that allowed within the process? Thank you.
Through the Chair, all evidence is permissible, and we will be putting forward the best evidence we possibly can into the hearings. And prior to hearings, there will be inevitably some mediation and certainly reporting back to this committee on what approach officers will be recommending. So, but absolutely, all the evidence we can possibly gather will be thrown at this one and put before the panel.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Newman.
Good morning. As it stands today, how confident are you that we are close enough on the level of information with respect to hydrological neutrality within, to inform the technical evidence to defend firstly, the qualifying matters as it relates to stormwater, and secondly, are there flood-prone areas that are not currently identified as, subject to a qualifying matter? Those are the first two questions.
Through the chair, it really is too early to say. We will obviously be working very closely with staff and Healthy Waters, the stormwater modelling work that they do, the analysis of the impacts of the flooding that's underway, working with all those involved in the response and recovery to make sure we've got as much information as possible. To try and sort of keep it as simple as I can, the plan change at the moment looks to roll over all of the protections that are in the unitary plan that would otherwise disappear under the Enabling Housing Supply Act, medium density residential standards and so on. The default would be that there will be none of those protections in place, but we use the technique of qualifying matters to identify flood hazard areas, areas of coastal instability, coastal erosion areas, coastal inundation areas, other geotechnically unstable areas are all identified in the plan change as being qualifying matters and reasons not to necessarily allow the intensification to take place. But whether that goes far enough to address all of the issues out of the recent storm events, that's the bit that's a bit too early to say. And I think your question, Councillor Newman, is around, are there some areas that we perhaps haven't identified in the past, or limitations that don't currently sit in the unitary plan that may need to sit in the unitary plan, and that's a tricky issue as to whether they can come into Plan Change 78 or not. But certainly the approach in 78 is to roll over all of the natural hazard provisions that we have in the unitary plan and have them as clear qualifying reasons not to enable the intensification.
So I guess it's one further from Chair. So, I mean, I'm probably delving into hypothetical here. So, are you suggesting that there is a mechanism for the introduction of variation within the Plan Change 78, or is this a situation whereby this might need to be, as best we can get it on Plan Change 78 and a subsequent Plan Change immediately thereafter?
Thanks. Through the Chair, addressed to some extent in the report, can't recall the exact paragraphs, but there are statutory or legal limitations in terms of what you can do under Plan Change 78, and that would apply to even doing a variation or an amendment to Plan Change 78. The intensification approach under the RMA is somewhat constrained. It is, as you'd expect, about enabling more housing and using qualifying matters to temper that. It's not about necessarily introducing new restrictions that didn't apply pre-Plan 78. So it may be the case that through this work discussed in the report that there is a subsequent phase of amending the unitary plan through a entirely separate plan change, not under the intensification provisions in the RMA, but a standalone plan change. And it may be that even that runs into some difficulties that we will need to discuss with government around some legislative statutory reforms that may be necessary. So there are limitations to what you can do in 78 to address hazards. The baseline is to try and roll over what we have in the unitary plan, to start introducing a wide range of new controls, starts becoming quite problematic, and even a variation of Plan Change 78, as I've said, would likely come unstuck from a legal point of view, and it would have to be a separate plan change.
Thank you, Councillor. I'll go to the Mayor Brown now.
Okay, thanks for this. I think the work that we're going to do will identify that the natural hazards and stormwater management impacted areas are rather larger than what we thought they were. We do have absolute information about where stormwater inundation occurred. I'm working quite closely with the Insurance Council, and they're giving me information about where the number of houses, where the claims are, and that information will be added to what you're going to present because it's irrefutable and it has some impact on costs and sizes, and it lists suburb by suburb the non-habitable homes. We know where they are on both, and we will be land stability runs beyond stormwater management. In some ways, it's just a little bit of pity that the process has got ahead of itself slightly, but this isn't time for us to actually offer excellent information. I think BC and D allow that to happen. I have no problem ringing and contacting the Minister about an extension of time at the moment, and if this doesn't grant an extension of time, then that will show to be rather an obstinate behaviour, and who knows, that they might not get an extension of time and in their jobs later in the year if they don't follow this one up, but that's another issue. So I support the additional parts of this, and just as I supported very much the work of the Planning Commission into doing a full examination of the impacts of what's happened in the last month. It does change things for Auckland, and it would be, I think it would be a foolish group to oppose that we go through this carefully, fully, and I do support BC and D added onto A. Thank you very much.
Kia ora, thank you, Mayor. I'll take that as comments. Councillor Fletcher, questions?
Thank you. I'm going to ask some questions, and I don't want to compromise my ability to speak, but could I ask them in the context of the gratitude that I feel to you and to the Mayor for entertaining these amendments that we're looking at today, because for the average person in the street, they don't know what Section 32 means, they don't know what Plan Change 78 means, and in the ward that Julie Ferry and I represent, where we have a large number of stickered properties, they are disinterested in that level of detail. They just want to know that we are pausing to stop and reflect, whilst Hawke's Bay is quite properly taking media attention. The lives of people are still being dramatically affected. The world changed for us on anniversary weekend. So the questions that I'm wanting to pose are not meant to be in any way vexatious. They're just simply for me to be able to understand, and the gratitude I feel that there has been a maturity to understand the importance of actually these amendments. So a few things spring to mind for me, and that comes into this issue of qualifying matters. So if I'm to read the amendments that we're looking at here, so when we look at natural hazards, stormwater, infrastructure provision, including transport, what we saw because of the floods, we did have some good work undertaken on qualifying matters, but what we saw with the floods is really these were region-wide. So to what extent are we going to be able to brief the Plan Change 78 Independent Hearings Panel on our ability or the desire to fund new infrastructure requirements and how they should interpret qualifying matters in light of the anniversary weekend floods?
Through the chair, shall I give that one a crack, John? That's a great question, Councillor Fletcher. What these recommendations say is that we will be bringing that work back to you to understand exactly what happened and where, and then whether you feel that the policy settings, you know, the margins around these things and where things are built and how, whether that needs to change. That would feed into Plan Change 78 when we get to that part of the hearing, and of course recommendation C is asking for whatever, whenever that matter comes, that it's later on so that we're able to do this work first and you're able to provide a position on it. John has also mentioned that the restrictions on Plan Change 78 that the government has put into the provisions means that you can't make areas any more restrictive than they already are in the unitary plan. So for example, if there is an area where right now in the unitary plan, let's say it says there's flooding, but for whatever reason the committee wants to make that more restrictive, so perhaps try and prohibit building there or something like that, then that's not going to be able to be done as part of Plan Change 78, and that was to John's point about, so it might be that we need to do another whole plan change process to change the unitary plan. So it gets really tricky. So I'm sorry, it's not an easy answer, but you know what I mean?
I really appreciate that, Megan, because I suppose in life ideal, if we are a creature of statute, we're required to do certain things. We delegated to the independent hearing panel, so all we can do is request of them now. We would like them to consider these things. It's costly to have independent hearings panel, and what we now know is with the floods, some of the information that they will have been working for is no longer accurate. It disadvantages submitters. And one of the next questions I had for you, do you think that this is going to prejudice submitters? Because it's really costly to participate in these processes. What is it that we can expect from the public and community groups in their participation?
Look, absolutely through the chair, and I guess that's what the chair is raising, I guess particularly with, well, B and C, is that can we discuss this, because council, as you say, is only one party to this. There's community out there as well. So can we discuss all of this together under the auspices of the Independent Hearings Panel at a time once we have provided you more advice and there's a better understanding, and we can of course pass that on to the community and specific applicants at the same time. So that's really what, as a result of B, that's what kind of C is saying. Can we push that out to make sure that there is a more, a conversation or a discussion that happens that everybody's got the same level of information on now, particularly if council's going to change its position or change something in that.
I would like to do more of a deep dive into that, but I don't want to monopolise time today and let others have an opportunity. And at one level, you want to have an emotional response to this, but at another level, I appreciate that we're working through a process and through legislation. But might I know when we could know the cost to council and water care of repairing the damage to infrastructure arising from the recent storm damage? I don't think that's an unreasonable question.
Through the chair, it's not unreasonable at all. I'm just not sure if I've got an answer. Do we know? I know we are working that through still, but Katarina might know.
I know that Mark Izzard has some high-level preliminary figures. After this meeting, we will get in touch with them to talk about when they may come before the committee. They have had some very high-level discussions about what it would cost to reinstate and what would it cost to build back better, but I think they'd prefer to be able to come directly to you and talk that through. So
I think the public have a right to know on that, so it'd be really important for me that we can, when it's appropriate, have that information publicly available, because I don't know, and maybe the Mayor can tell me what provision is proposed for either in the current draft budget.
In terms of trying to estimate the cost, we've got our staff working on what the cost of our things is best they can. I'm closely working with the Insurance Council. I have a formal meeting with them again on Tuesday next week, because they're actually a pretty good clearinghouse of where the first chunks of money are going to come in. And they also give us a very good idea about where things are, which will also inform. One of the things that worries me is that we're going to find that the stormwater management cutouts in the current one don't cover everywhere, which has suddenly become a stormwater issue. And I think Megan's laid out that has some implications which may mean that lead to a complete plan change, which is why another string to the bow of what I'm going to ring the Minister and suggest that he grants an extension of time, because rushed decisions in the midst of complicated issues never give good results. And so I think this gives us as much grunt as we need at this stage. It's just unfortunate that the Plan Change 78 process has got itself underway, not because of anything the Council's done, it's the legislation which has been foisted upon us. Legislation which I'm not at all keen or happy on, I might say, but that's what governments do when you let them sit in rooms in Wellington.
Thank you for your intervention and your leadership on this, therefore, to enable us to potentially pivot, if we can, at some point. Megan, just before I conclude, because I'll take more questions if I'm allowed after everyone else has had a go, but prior to the anniversary weekend floods, what was the additional cost of providing the necessary infrastructure to service the new living zoning proposed in Plan Change 78 before the world changed?
Through the chair, I'm not sure we've got an answer for that either, but I'm going to flick to John because that's what I can do. Yeah.
Okay. Well, plan changes enable development, and I guess this particular plan change is looking at enabling development over a 20 to 30-year plus period. That's the government policy, really. It's a long-term enablement. So the assessment of the costs of providing all the infrastructure for all of that development is not a figure that we really have. It's just something that's very difficult, if not impossible, to calculate. So it's an iterative exercise of providing infrastructure in line with where the development's occurring, committed projects, but no, we don't have an answer to that, unfortunately, Councillor.
We don't know. No, that's really helpful. And finally, to the Mayor, could you bring to your negotiations with the Minister and also the Minister of Finance what the urgency is of deciding Plan Change 78 when the Auckland Unitary Plan addresses demand for the next 30 years?
Well, I'm doing my best to highlight that not only the issues that you raised, but in fact I think that the growth figures are heroic. Where they're wanting to do it is not necessarily where it will occur or where we even want it. I think we'll also be highlighting the point that the Environment Court has overruled the district plan in a number of cases to the detriment of the city. There are people in Red 2 houses at Muriwai at the moment in an area which the Rodney Council attempted to prevent to be developed, and so that the Environment Court itself has sticky fingers on these things. This whole issue is going to require much more thinking than what's been given, and I would be very, very surprised if the government aren't on both sides, because it's a cross-party issue, this one, you must remember.
And thank you for your leadership in remaining for this item today, because I know you were meant to be out west in Karikari, but speaking personally, I really appreciate your presence and your leadership here today. Thank you.
That's good. I thought it's important. I'll sit this one out, then I'm going to go and look at wrecked houses for the afternoon.
Kia ora, Councillor. Thank you for your questions. And yeah, I think it's important to reinforce, and this is what these additional resolutions are about, to reinforcing what's in the agenda. We are specific around having to review and increase the focus on Plan Change 78, but because of what Megan has said, Plan Change 78 is sort of the red herring for trying to improve areas or reduce stuff from the unitary plan side of things. So that's what the broader set of options we've got and work commissioned in this, because it could mean quick plan changes. We're in discussion, I've been in discussion with various ministers around potential for emergency powers or potential for managed retreat, all those sort of things that could happen hopefully quicker than a normal plan change if we're truly wanting to give people options quickly. But all of that work has to be done with the data that we can find.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, for your explanation on that, because for some of us, we would have liked to have seen staging with the Auckland Unitary Plan, and certainly it seems incredible to me that we're not thinking about staging in terms of moving forward, but I really appreciate the opportunity to speak on this.
Thank you. And to, I think, costs, I asked Barry for some figures around even just healthy waters. I think it was 3,500 requests for service in the first 3 weeks since the floods, which is pretty phenomenal, and about 3,700 tonnes of waste that's been picked up, as well as obviously the houses that we've got there. Next question, we've got Councillor Henderson.
Thank you. I've got a couple of questions, Chair. There's been, I think, quite a
bit of misunderstanding around what Plan Change 78 does in relation to natural hazards and floodplains. So could I just ask you firstly to remind the committee what the status quo is for us regarding the qualifying matter relating to building on floodplains? What did we go to the IHP with?
Through the chair, the plan change identifies the floodplain rules that sit in the unitary plan that require a resource consent to be applied for to develop in a floodplain. The plan change identifies that as a qualifying matter, so that particular rule that sits in the unitary plan that says you cannot develop as of right in the 1% AEP, a 100-year floodplain, it is tagged as a qualifying matter. So that's the first one. Similarly, with areas near coastal cliffs, there is a rule that sits in the unitary plan, and that is tagged in Plan Change 78 as a qualifying matter, so that someone would still require resource consent when building in proximity to cliffs. For coastal inundation, taking into account sea level rise, there are rules that sit in the unitary plan, and Plan Change 78 has identified those rules as a qualifying matter, so that someone cannot develop in those areas as of right without a resource consent. And there are a couple of others, perhaps a bit more obscure, around just general land stability and steep slopes that are also tagged as qualifying matters. So those natural hazard rules, that whole package that's sitting in the unitary plan is essentially rolled over into Plan Change 78 and tagged as a qualifying matter, so that anyone building in that area would need a resource consent.
Thanks, that's very useful. So if all of these matters are already qualifying matters that we're planning to essentially roll over, what do we expect to achieve with more time? I'm asking staff.
When it comes, so I've talked about the natural hazard rules that sit in the unitary plan and that they have been rolled over. Zoning is a key part of the unitary plan, as I think we all know, and we have attempted to apply a low density zoning to many of the areas that we know are subject to natural hazards such as flooding. It may be that we could apply that low density zone more widely, and there are submissions seeking that low density zoning is applied more widely for hazard reasons. So that is an issue that we need to explore. So that's probably the key one. Yes, we've tagged the correct rules. There are limitations, as you've heard from Megan and I, about sort of applying new rules through 78 for natural hazards, but have we got the right approach to zoning is probably the fundamental thing that as planners we're thinking through now. There are submissions saying that there should be no low-density residential zone at all, and that the hazard rules are sufficient. For example, Kangaora submission takes that approach, that low-density zoning shouldn't be used. The hazard rules are sufficient. We've got a hybrid approach in 78, a bit of both. But, potentially there may be an argument for using that low-density zone more widely in hazard areas.
Okay, look, I could ask several more on that point, but I think I might leave it. Just probably one question, Chair. So if we're looking at a review here, housing demand doesn't change, whatever zone we put on these things. So will this review be focused on further restriction of housing, or are we going to consider allowing more housing to be enabled than is currently in place in areas that are not at risk of flooding?
Well, that's a really broad question. So submissions on the Plan Change 78 are seeking more intensification. So that's an issue that the council will have to consider as we go through the hearings. And then we have the submissions that I mentioned saying we're not doing enough for natural hazards. So it'll be about striking the right balance there. But I guess the focus of this report is really on the agenda today is about have we got the right approach to natural hazards broadly and in terms of 78, have we got the right approach? No, we're not suggesting a focus of restricting opportunities for housing through this piece of work here.
Okay, thank you. Just one follow-up, and thank you, Chair, for this. So through this approach, we might be looking at either down zoning or indeed red zoning areas that might be flood prone and hazard prone, and it wouldn't be responsible for us to build there. I guess I'm just wondering if we're looking to do that and essentially restrict supply, wouldn't it be responsible to then look at the other areas where we might want to increase supply because they're safe and they're okay, and we want to encourage development in safe areas?
Through the chair and to the committee, You may recall presentations in the past about the baseline unitary plan already enables 20 to 30 years worth of housing. If you add in Plan Gen 78, we're taking it well beyond that. So if through the work around natural hazards, there are some additional constraints that Council puts forward to the hearings panel, or potentially through a plan change, it would have to be a widespread, significant constraint to really have any big impact on the overall capacity for housing that sits in the unitary plan already as operative and augmented by Plan Change 78. So I wouldn't, at this point in time, suggest that there will be a need to look at enabling considerably more intensification purely off the back of natural hazards.
Thank you, Councillor. Thank you for clarifying. And I think a further clarification for me and for the public is that what this review is about is ensuring we have more evidence, or I guess more backed up evidence for our current qualifying matters through what we've seen. Staff need that because there are large submitters, won't name them, who don't want any qualifying matters or low density zones. So we will need to have that more, we can say these are our floodplains, but now we have a lot of evidence that will back up why. But it's to be very clear, the Plan Change 78 piece of the review of the overall list of things we're commissioning cannot downzone from the unitary plan. We cannot go, that would have to be another tool or working with government or another plan change. We can't downzone any areas from the unitary plan rules through Plan Change 78, but it has to be part of it. This is why Councillor Dalton and I, through consultation with the Mayor a month ago, put Plan Change 78 in as part of the number of items, because we need to make sure we have that clear evidence and have the tools for our officers who will be presenting on why we have those qualifying matters in there. And we can prove by pictures, essentially, in some cases, or, yeah. So, Councillor Ferry.
Thank you. A couple of questions from me. A couple of my colleagues have mentioned the importance of people being able to have their say in the plan change process. Obviously, that now sits with the hearings panel and not with us. That work has been passed over to them. But I did wonder if, particularly in regard to the groups that have signed the petition, I would imagine that most, if not all of them, are currently submitters. Do we have any sort of idea on that? Because that will be a mechanism for them to make sure that these points are raised through the hearing process. Do we have any information on that?
Unfortunately, Councillor, no, I don't, but I suspect you're right. A number of the groups would be submitters. So, but we'd have to come back to you on that to confirm of those who signed the petition, how many are actually submitters.
Yes, I think that would be useful information for governing body members to have, that might sort of give some reassurance about some of those issues of the information being able to be put in front of the panel. The other query I have is, I've raised this in the emergency committee as well. I'm a little bit concerned about, in the case of some of the stickering, are we relying on self-reporting from homeowners for those building assessments? Because I'm particularly worried about renters who don't necessarily, might say to the landlord, hey, I think the house needs checking. And the landlord says, yep, sure, I'll get onto it, and then for whatever reason does not. And so we may not have accurate data in that space. So that's something I'd be keen to understand in this context of how we're going to look at other reporting mechanisms beyond the RBAs to identify where the flooding was particularly acute.
Through the chair, I will take that. I just know, trying to channel in Craig Hobbs, I know where there was obviously a weather event, we obviously went kind of house by house with that.
Yeah.
But yes, we have asked to call out to say, if you are concerned about your house in any way, please kind of let us know. So there's a little bit of both. But if you need more information, I'll need to ask Craig to come back to you on that.
Yeah, I think we might just need to look at some comms to renters in particular, who may not otherwise be that empowered in this space. My final question is around the impact of this in regard to the areas which are primarily in Councillor Fletcher and my ward that are actually whited out from Plan Change 78 because of the light rail corridor. I'm aware of some significant flooding that happened under the whited out bits. Also some significant areas, as Councillor Henderson points to, that performed really well in the flooding. So how will this potentially interact with the fact that we've got that big whited out area through the isthmus? Thank you.
Thanks, through the chair. So as you may recall, the reason for that whiteout area through the isthmus and out to South Auckland, Margaret and out to the airport is because we're waiting for confirmation of the preferred route for the light rail project and the stations along that route. And until we get that information, you can't really do the intensification plan change properly. So we've made, as council, that decision in the last term to exclude that area. Indications are around about the middle of this year, we should have the route and stations confirmed. Once Auckland Light Rail lodge the notice of requirement for the route and the stations, that's the trigger for council to initiate the plan change to fill in that white area, and that will come back to this committee, and issues around hazards, qualifying matters, and where we're at with the hearings on the rest of the region would factor into that, the development of that plan change. So that's the process there. We wait for the notice of requirement to be lodged for light rail, then we come to you as a committee with a recommended plan change, and that plan change would be under the same constraints as Plan Change 78. There is a limit to what we can do around natural hazards, but certainly the default approach of rolling over all of the existing hazard controls and having a bit of a zoning approach to hazard areas would be likely in that plan change.
Thank you. Councillor Turner.
No, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm lost in the technicalities of all this. It seems I'd reserve my right just to make a comment if I can later. Thank you.
Absolutely. Councillor Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We seem to be coming to the end of questions, but so I'd, if I could, it might save time if I make a comment and a question all in one package.
Well, try and make a question, and then, but I won't. I'm not keen on you having your 5-minute speaking turn right now.
I support. Before I get to the question, I just want to say I support the recommendations, Mr. Chair. We're sensibly seeking breathing space from the government as we assess the consequences of these unprecedented extreme weather events, and I might say so. Auckland having gone through a civil emergency, maybe we can understand the wisdom of those good councillors in Christchurch who totally rejected the national policy statement at the start. But I think there is concern that this has been imposed on Auckland, that Parliament, and I'm talking about all the major parties except for ACT, I believe, are joined together in this approach currently. That they in effect have undertaken a district plan change, somewhat bizarre. But anyway, I think, leaving aside criticisms of Parliament, I think we have to look at our own role. And it was interesting to see in the trade journal One Roof that Auckland Council approved 2,223 dwellings last year in hazard zones and floodplains, which is 9% of the consents issued. So we've been engaged with the property industry in a risky game, and the people who are faced with the consequences are people whose homes and savings have been ruined, and you could describe they've been red stickered, and there's some 7,000 people homeless in Auckland as a consequence of these weather events. Now, it's interesting, I had a call from a senior figure in the government about a local matter, and it's interesting to see the perspective from the government side. And this person was particularly concerned about a development currently under application for 12 townhouses in an area that I saw extremely badly damaged in the recent floods. And yet this is still going on. The senior person in the government thought, from her perspective, that under the national policy statement, floodplains hazard zones were a qualifying matter. So what was going on? So that's interesting. I suspect this approach long predates the national policy statement. So my question is, in regard to the townhouse development at 38 Sackville Street, which no doubt you'll be aware of, because that's right adjacent to where pensioners had to be evacuated and just downstream from a number of red-stickered homes, whether that's part of the national policy statement and the operative part of Plan Change 78, or is it Auckland Council business as usual? Question, Mr. Chair.
It may be hard to answer the specific address, but did you want to try on that question, John?
Yeah, Chair and Councillor Lee, it's yeah, unfortunately we can't answer question about that specific property. I'm not aware of the facts around that one. What may be of use is just to recap that the one aspect of Plan Change 78 that applied straight away at the point of public notification was the medium density residential standards. So if it's in a 3-storey medium density residential area and there are no qualifying matters applying to that property, then the way that the government prepared the amendment to the RMA is that they get the benefit of that medium density straight away. But it may be the Sackville property isn't an area that's tagged in 78 as a qualifying matter, in which case they don't get the benefit of Plan Change 78 until it gets right the way through the hearings and council decision making next year. But if it's a piece of property that is free of any qualifying matters in Plan Change 78, then they do get the benefit of immediate benefit of the permitted 3 dwellings, 3 stories high. So we'd have to look into the specifics of that case.
Mr. Chairman, can I just remind the meeting that another disaster, a natural disaster, I guess, at Whakari, White Island, the Court of Inquiry is just getting underway now. So the wheels of time grind slowly, but they can grind slowly, but they can grind exceedingly small. And I think we have to be prudent about our own role in this matter. And I think the breathing space that you are recommending that we seek from the government also should apply to the way we are issuing consents and we are allowing or not allowing public notification, not allowing in this case, on these matters, because there's going to be repercussions, I'm sure, from people who are getting rates bills soon, who cannot live in their houses, who are homeless, but they still will be paying rates. They bought their homes on consented properties in good faith. And so I think the breathing space we are seeking from the government, and quite wisely, should apply to ourselves as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. I have 3 more questions and then we'll move to the debate. Councillor Watson.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Just a couple of questions on the proposed scope as it applied to the paper that was went to the delegated members. Is the notion that this Plan Change 78 considers largely or slightly affected by recent events, is that identified as a risk when we go to, risks and mitigation? Is the fact that there isn't too much response to anything we choose to put up, is that identified as a risk?
So through the chair, that is not identified as a risk within the risk section of the report. It's a requirement and a legislative aspect that John and the team have to go through when processing their reassessment. So there are legal container that your decisions, IHP decisions are operating within.
Yeah, so I guess, just kind of speaking in pragmatic terms, and certainly from a public point of view, I would think that the public expectation would be that, there's a really meaningful response now and within this kind of phase one timeline of 8 to 12 weeks, we're told. And I say that because when I look at our other submissions to, the MPSUD and the medium density provisions, in my reading of it, we've already alluded to, if not on the scale that we experience, but at least the possibility that there's unintended consequences. So if I look at that paper, we had our submission in just March, we talk about, damaging the livability of the city for Aucklanders, unintended consequences. When we go to water care, we talk about, development occurring that water care is hasn't planned for, doesn't have the infrastructure needs. We talk about infrastructure funding and financing, exacerbating challenges, and in some respects we use terms like a strong view that this runs contrary to core objectives, work against the functioning of urban environment, result in poor quality build outcomes that reduce livability for residents, a whole lot of stuff about infrastructure. So I guess for anyone looking on and for anyone within making commentary, they haven't listened or didn't listen to that, and that was made by experts. There were not just council, there was all manner of planners, infrastructure, consult, etc., etc. So I guess my concern in this is that that it may well proceed along lines that don't alter fundamentally, and that's politically driven. We're in a hearings process, or going into a hearings process now. So I guess I would really like to know, and particularly as it goes to this phase one, which outlined in that paper again, has a lot of briefings going on when we talk about what we're doing. A legal briefing on council's liability, a briefing on council's approach to consenting, a briefing on council requirements, a briefing in climate change scenarios. This is the next 12 weeks. I guess, sure, we're going to review the approach to proposed Plan Change 78, but I guess if I was sitting in the public gallery today and listening to this, I'd be wanting to know, given that in the qualifying matters I took to be entirely inadequate, certainly for my ward, entirely inadequate. So if it's just a tinkering round with the status quo of our submission as far as qualifying matters go, then I don't think we're really taking account of what's happened just recently. So that's what I'm really seeking, John, is some sort of response to that.
Okay. Kirsten.
Thanks, Chair. Councillor Watson. Yeah, really, just to reiterate, we're in this process with Plan Change 78. We have submissions for and against. We have some submissions on more intensification, some on restrictions on natural hazards, some for those restrictions, some against. So that's going through a process that has limitations on what we can do, with a general baseline of we can't improve on what's in the unitary plan pre-78. We essentially have to rely on that and rely on certain provisions in the operative unitary plan as being qualifying matters. However, through this broader piece of work, it may be that we identify that the operative unitary plan needs to be amended, and that would need to, for reasons of natural hazards, and that would need to be addressed through a separate plan change that we would have to do regardless of Plan Change 78 going through its process. So we really need to make the best of Plan Change 78 and the submissions on that. This isn't going to Parliament unless the Council rejects the recommendations of the panel. It's going to, and because the Minister, not the Parliament, it's going to our own Council-appointed independent hearing commissioners, and then back to Council next year once they've considered the submissions. That's Plan Change 78. So I think there's a lot of potential to work with the information we receive, put a very strong case before the independent hearings panel. But if there are matters that we simply can't address because of the limitations under the statute on 78, then we would have to pick that up and have it as a separate plan change.
And I think, just to clarify again, Councillor, this is why Councillor Dalton and I, in consultation with the Mayor and Deputy Mayor a month ago, we were clear that Plan Change 78 needed to be a slice of this whole program, but it needed to be far broader, far wider, all regulatory, look at the full plan, unitary plan, and discussions, potentially emergency powers and things with government, because Plan Change 78 is only one tiny piece of the issue here that we need to deal with. If we need dramatic changes to where we are allowing housing or wider floodplains and all those sorts of things, that is not addressed through Plan Change 78. Now I'm saying 28. That's not addressed through Plan Change 78 at all, and we can't require or even the independent hearing commissioners cannot consider downzoning or expanding qualifying matters that didn't exist before Plan Change 78. So that's the issue here, is that I think a lot of people think it's going to crack all of the nuts, but actually we need to look at this, protect our qualifying matters, and then use other tools through this process very quickly, far quicker than maybe we've ever done before, in response to the floods. And that's why I guess we've got a bit distracted on Plan Change 78 because it's so front of mind, but it's actually got to be far broader, and we'll probably need government help if we're wanting to do any sort of drastic moves around managed retreat or those sort of things. We just can't do that on our own very quickly. Did you have more questions?
I'll reserve the right to speak. I think that it's probably more appropriate. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Darby, and then Councillor Newman.
Thanks. Question, maybe two. Chair, you've sort of just led into what I was wanting to ask Megan about, was here we're responding/reacting to Plan Change 78, but I'm mindful that we've got other council-led plan changes, particularly, say, 79 and 80. 79 is on transport infrastructure, probably doesn't touch this area, but 80 is on resilience to climate change. 82 and 83 aren't relevant, but no doubt there's going to be some others that are already underway, council-led. There's private plan changes, there's fast-track consent applications, gateway tests, all of that. So, Megan, for you, of course, it's natural that 78 is top of mind, but there are others. And is there merit in tweaking this so that we actually capture, if we can, the other plan changes or other processes which are underway, because there's a lot more than just 78?
Through the Chair, yes, you're right. And that was referenced in the previous Planning Committee resolution that you made, which has resulted in the scope. So, for example, it was 78 to 80 something, three, yes, the numbers. We also, I know, had a discussion about what does this mean for consents in the process or plan changes in the process. And so part of this in both phase 1 and 2 will cover that, but ultimately it is really until the council makes any decisions to change its policy settings, so to change the intensity or reduce intensity or somehow change the patterns or expectations of building, can that really then lead to changes in, regulatory documents, consents, plan changes, all that kind of thing. So it's not quite rock in a hard place, but it's a little bit trying to understand what we can do now versus what we need changes in policy to occur, which would then obviously impact, everything, or it would result in a process like a plan change that would have a much broader impact.
I get that. I just can't recall the detail of, say, plan change, I think it's 80, which is resilience to climate change. Maybe that's one that is important to think about here. We're not actually asking the commissioners that have probably been appointed to that one to put things on hold until such time as we have this information come in. Now, there may be others. I mean, are we thinking that through? I understand that we will do things later once we've examined the situation, but I'm just wanting to have some assurance that we're not letting things out of the gate because we haven't mentioned it other than 78 here. We're not mentioning plan change 80, for example.
I understand that. John, do you think there would be any particular benefit in referencing, clarity in representing the other plan changes? Clearly, when we write to the Independent Hearings Panel and the Minister, it would be for the work that the Independent Hearings Panel has been asked to do, which is all of those plan changes. But, John, do you think that would seek clarification?
Thanks, Megan. Thanks, Councillor Darby. Yep, just thinking that one through. So it really is of the package of plan changes Council notified in September last year. Plan change 78 is probably the one that is probably the only one that really picks up on this issue of natural hazards, climate change, and it's a change to the regional policy statement. It's just really beefing up some of our policies around climate that's set in the regional policy statement at the moment. Certainly in terms of going to the Minister, that's not relevant because it's not under the same streamlined process. It's a standard council plan change. It is being heard by the same commissioners, so I'm just wondering whether maybe in C there might be some wording that we would want to consider the opportunity to have the benefit of the information that we're getting from the recent storm events feeding into the plan change 80 as well. So I can see 80 potentially a discussion with the panel around the timing of hearings on 80. There would be some benefit to that.
So is it just 80 or are there other things like, are there private plan changes or are there other council-led plan changes that, I mean, look, I don't have them all in my head, John. I'm sure you don't either, but
So
there's a lot underway.
I guess the issue is, and it was really about highlighting plan change 78 because there had been some concern that we were not dealing with that. We were always, even before you put these three up there, dealing with this on every single plan change we are doing. What this says is that we're just asking the overall part of the hearings around natural hazards and stormwater management to be sort of at the end or pushed as far out as possible through the myriad of hearing dates, which will be, I think, decided next week. So there's enough time for evidence to be presented. We're not asking for a full halt.
No, I know that. Look, plan change 80 is relevant here in my eyes, and we're not referring to it. And John, if we could just follow through with maybe your suggested words.
Okay. And can I just say, in terms of private plan change or any other plan change, absolutely, as as officers, we will be looking very carefully at whether the recent events have any bearing on the evidence that council puts to the hearings on those plan changes. So I think hopefully you can take that as a given that as professionals we'll be looking very carefully at whether there's anything new we might need to say. Yeah.
Thank you.
Does that leave plan change 80? You said you were going to...
No. Megan said that she was putting it in. Yeah. Councillor Newman.
A little bit wider of this, but John, our friend Andrew McKenzie and the team from Kāinga Ora, they were one of the submitters that has been quite radical in terms of seeing no place for the single house precinct. So can I ask, operationally, you might not know this, but in light of the Auckland anniversary flooding events, have they given notice of their intention to revise or withdraw that particular submission, given what has happened, and including what has happened to their portfolio?
No, we haven't received any advice of that sort and not aware of them doing that. I'd be quite surprised if they did, but
Councillor Fletcher, last question.
Thank you. My question is to Megan. I just want to understand within the delegation that we've given to the independent hearings panel and the amendments that are up, or the motion that is up there today, what input will you have into the pre-hearing conference that's scheduled for the 6th of March, and what briefing will you give those commissioners? And can you advise whether any of those commissioners have an engineering background?
Through the chair, John, I'll just put you on notice about the engineering background question. So look, in terms of the pre-hearing conference, council will be represented, and so we will put together our positions based on this conversation, clearly on the timing matters. So we will reflect that directly to the commissioner, to the independent hearings panel. So we're directly represented, and we will directly speak to them. We are also happy to answer any questions that they might have in terms of clarification or even a representation of this conversation, because there is more that has been discussed here today than is just written down, obviously, in 4 recommendations. So we'll ensure that that's an accurate representation of this conversation.
Will
John,
you be present yourself?
I wasn't going to be, but I'm happy for any feedback on that from the committee, if you wish to give that to me. John, did you have a question? An answer to the engineering question?
Yeah, in terms of the commissioners, none of them have an engineering qualification as far as I'm aware. One of the commissioners, Julianne Chetton, has a environmental science and geography background with some expertise in coastal geomorphology, so that will certainly be of relevance to hazards and severe weather events as they relate to the coast. The panel can certainly commission engineering advice, and will be receiving engineering advice from Auckland Council, ourselves, and no doubt other submitters, but they're not qualified in engineering themselves.
Thank you for that response, and I'm happy to give some personal feedback at the appropriate time. I just want the assurance that the difficulty for submitters will be made clear to the independent hearings panel, because this is not business as usual.
Through the chair, happy to ensure that happens, and also happy to talk with you further. Councillor Fletcher.
Apologies, sorry, we were just working on that plan change 80. Was there a question to me then? No. Okay, sorry. Right, we will move to the speaking on this. So, anyone, Councillor Turner.
Sorry, I'm lost in all this technicality. I could not explain it to the public if they asked me to, but they are very clear with me. They see building happening everywhere. They see building outstripping infrastructure everywhere, and it is not just the flood-prone areas that they're concerned about. It's the effect that all the areas have on the flood-prone areas, and maybe even increase the areas which become flood-prone. So, to a man out there, I'm being told, please, please, just stop this. Now, we can't stop it, although if I could join Christchurch, I would. I have heard Councillor Baker state a couple of days ago in another meeting that we can engineer our way out of floodplains. I believe we can too. Whether it's appropriate or not in all cases or in some is another question. There's a whole bunch of just basic down-to-earth stuff here the public want to be able to see take place. They want some visibility. We need some time. I'd like that to be as strong as possible to give us that time, please. Thank you.
Kia ora, Councillor. Councillor Watson.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and certainly agree with the sentiments expressed by Councillor Turner there. I guess what's become really clear for me today is the restrictions, actually, the restrictive nature of this, and this technical and difficult to access from a public point of view, this whole Plan Change 78 actually is. And whereas after the recent events in particular, people really have have an expectation that the council will now step up to the plate on their behalf. And I guess we are restricted through this sort of amendments and additions in this process, but what hasn't really been put on the table today, and it's maybe not appropriate, but it needs to be at least recognised, that there must be a corresponding political response to what has happened, because and what I've heard today, you know, I can see a prospect where we engage in the usual good faith and come up with all the right evidence, and perhaps things don't change too much at the end of it. And we know at the end of it, if we disagree with the findings of the hearing commissioner, it goes to the minister for the decision. So I guess this kind of assault on what, you know, previously we would have regarded as a democratic planning process is one that we are restricted on in our deliberations today. I can see in my ward, you know, sure, there's Plan Change 78, there's the MDRS that's already operative. Just recently, we're aware of this, the full effects of this COVID Recovery Fast Tracking Consenting Act, so which again all to do with increasing the intensification down in Orewa, the community there faces the prospect of the intensity, and a big development is going to be doubled, just like that. If it was the council's unitary plan, that would be at half the intensity of what's being proposed. The input of the public into that doesn't exist. It's actually just a commentary by adjacent people adjudged adjacent. So the real public concern that has been amplified, and people are joining the dots now. So in the latest floods, I went down to Browns Bay, the business area was flooded right out, businesses there, Teslas, new Teslas, written off expensive equipment to service the Teslas, water up, you know, a metre high, like all over other parts of Auckland. But what really struck me was that people are joining the dots now. Panel beaters are saying, you've got to stop this intensification. That's the existing status quo. They pointed to where the water came down and there was a big intensified FAB type development up there. So people are now realising what's happening as a consequence of planning decisions. Plan Change 78 proposes to rack that right up again, you know, as if the unitary plan wasn't enough. So obviously through this process, we're trying to do what we can, but I guess what today signals is that as a group, we have to do a lot more politically to make it clear to this government and their supporters, because it was cross-party, that these events have showed that this is a disaster in waiting, that we have seen the effects of now, and that if we don't respond in the way that's required, and that is to rethink the whole push of this unbridled ad hoc intensification across Auckland, there are going to be serious repercussions for Aucklanders, more so than they've already had going forward. So it's the people on the receiving end of the water that are the ones that are suffering now and will go on suffering for quite some time. That's come about as a consequence of existing shortcomings. What we're proposing here or responding to stands to make that even worse. So I just say, Mr. Chair, thanks for the ability to examine the Plan Change 78, but really what's going to be required is a far more robust political response that really gives voice to what many people in Auckland are now saying after this flood.
Councillor Leone. Then one more.
Kia ora. Look, I just wanted to make a few comments around intensification, because I know the kōrero's around Plan Change 78, but I mean, I know one of the major concerns around this kōrero is the amount of intensification in Tamaki Makaurau, and there are actually some areas that have done really well where there's been significant amount of intensification. I hope that when we're looking at this investigation that would be highlighted, or obviously, Megan, those things will be looked at, because you know, I'm really interested to also understand the difference between the fact that you've got areas, I mean, most of the homes that I'm aware of that were affected in the floods, and when we talk about the floods, we're talking about a once in 100 year amount of rain that's coming down. So I just want to, you know, I know that we need to plan to make sure that we have the right plans in place for our city, but realising that this flood is, you know, 1 in 100 years, and also that intensification has been done really well internationally. There's lots of research on it, as long as it has actually got all the research behind it. So I just wanted to make that comment. Thank you.
Kia ora, Councillor. Councillor Walker.
So I'm supportive of this, but it really goes nowhere near far enough. It's Plan Change 78 in its entirety that needs to be rejected. There's urgency. I'm going through all the catchment plans across my ward systematically. I've got one in my hand, which is Stanmore Bay. This is just one. It's out of date. It doesn't reflect the current development, let alone the development that's occurring from Plan Change 78. What we see on the ground, driven by developers, is every stick of vegetation on every property being developed removed. Every stick, bulldozed, flat site, wall-to-wall retaining, sometimes substantial retaining. No provision for on-site parking, so effectively you've got more development on the site. Against the background where the stormwater doesn't cope because the existing pipe network doesn't cope, the overland flow paths are being culverted or filled in, and they're not being identified, and where they are, they're not adequately responding. The roading network is often poorly designed. A road in a storm event where the catchments do not cope, and the catchments do not cope because the pipes from the catchments in this catchment are undersized. They were undersized years ago, and they are undersized now. So when the catchments don't cope, the roads become the overland flow paths, but the water then diverts to the path of least resistance, which is over often private properties. So the private properties get flooded out, and that is what is happening throughout the ward I represent. In addition to that, in parts of the ward, particularly the semi-rural parts of the ward, there are massive clean fill landfills, some illegal, some not, generally inadequately monitored and consented. And they are, without exception, almost all slipping, sometimes onto private property, but also onto council streams. And immense amounts, and I mean immense amounts of sediment, and there's an environmental cost to this that needs to be assessed in terms of the study, are flowing into our coastal environment. And the quantum of death across marine life and our aquatic life is, I am sure, phenomenal. And this is accumulating on an ongoing basis. So we have a problem here of a significant scale, and this council, at many meetings when I've raised this issue, on a decision-by-decision basis, has not questioned and has allowed developments to occur. Through the unitary plan process, we were deficient. So the unitary plan process already allows development where it should not be happening. And almost without exception, and again the Stanmore Bay catchment is an example, all of the outfalls are below mean high water springs. So if we have had a worse event coinciding with a spring tide or a king tide, the stormwater literally cannot escape. It backs up. It backs up in the overland flow paths, it backs up in the culverts, it backs up in the pipes, and it ends up in people's properties. And sea level rise is locked in to the extent of tens of metres. It is simply a matter of time. We know that. The International Panel on Climate Change knows that. And that whole process is accelerating at a rapid rate. So on a week-by-week basis, all the data that is arriving to us, and I constantly raise this with our people in stormwater, is informing us of that. So that is the reality that we face. When I go to a meeting on Friday around this particular catchment, I will be trying to work with this community to work on surface water management plans, to try and get the community to assist, to bring matters to the attention of the officers, which matters should be captured through this process, but aren't. So what I put to you is there is urgency, and we should have, together with this, a full-on campaign against the government, against the parties, and I continue to ask for this, in the Herald, in papers, so that Aucklanders are familiar with the reality that confronts them.
Thank you,
because
Councillor.
essentially, this is what we can do, but it is political.
Thank you, Councillor.
Thank you.
Councillor Ferry.
Thank you. I feel like we're straying a bit from the actual topic at hand, and I'm probably going to indulge in that a little bit too. In regard to what our people are telling us they want and need, I just don't want people to lose sight of the fact that we do need to enable housing. We do need to make sure everybody has a warm, dry, safe home. And I say warm and dry deliberately in the context of flooding. You know, we do not want to create a city where it is cheaper to live in places that flood all the time. And I see this work as assisting with that. It does also mean, though, that we do need to seriously look at other parts of our city where they did not flood or where the infrastructure did cope, and look at enabling more housing there. So, you know, I tautoko my colleague from Waitakere over the other side in his comments on that. I think recent events have showed us a problem that actually we already knew we had. We already knew that we have underinvested in both the infrastructure, hard and soft, and also the maintenance of that infrastructure over many years. That's not the fault of Plan Change 78. That's about past decisions, some of which were made by people around this table. And I note that in some of the areas that I'm looking at flooding in my community, I was at a house yesterday, the people there had been there 38 years, and the house was there before that. Some of the areas I'm looking at, the housing goes back to the 50s and the 60s. So this is not a new issue. It's new that we had a particularly disastrous event, but in a lot of cases, these areas have been flooding for some time. And they've been trying to get assistance, and they've not been able to get it because we as a governing body have actually under-resourced this area for years. And so I just ask my colleagues to reflect on that we need to, around this table, not just rail against some of the symptoms, we actually need to get to the causes, and we are responsible for voting for the work to happen and for the work to be funded. And that's a long-term thing that we all need to commit to, and I would remind us of our obligations. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Fletcher.
Well, thank you. In speaking to this, I don't want to relitigate what has gone on in the past. I want to be able to respond to the collective anxiety we're seeing from so many in our community. I think that there's a level of depression about the immediacy of the flood is over and done with, and now people are trying to live with the consequences of those floods. And they're fearful that the rain is going to come down and there's going to be more that will impact on them. And what we're seeing today, I really welcome, and that is a collegiality in the way that we are trying to move forward on this. Yes, we are bound by legislative constraints, but I feel from today that whether it's Mr. Ian Wright, who's the property manager for Queen's Arcade, who is complaining about stormwater being pumped from development downtown, to the residents of Margot Street that had to swim to escape the floods, that we are going to, in addition to this work, we are going to monitor those contracts that we have. What they're wanting to hear from us is the practical stuff. That if we have a contract with Fulton Hogan, who is actually going to be monitoring? Who is ensuring that this work is being done? What we've got to do in terms of leadership is not just respond piece by piece. This is an overall jigsaw, and we need to put all of the pieces of that jigsaw together. I want to say that Plan Change 78 has been challenging for me because there was, I think, well-intentioned perhaps desires by the National and the Labour Party to respond to the housing crisis. But no matter how much, and we had some very eloquent submissions, and there were good submissions that were put by Auckland Council. Individuals amongst us went and took the time to go and make submissions on it. And we tried to highlight the fact this is not a land supply problem. What Auckland has is an affordability problem. And we still haven't had any formal response from either of those two parties on how we're going to address the affordability issues. So I just want to thank my colleagues for the way in which we've responded today. I hope that this can be passed unanimously because it sets us on a pathway that could have a bit more common sense than what we've seen in the past. And I have confidence that with the leadership of the elected members led by the Mayor and all of us working together, that we'll be able to go back to those Aucklanders that are just full of grief, they're full of anxiety, to say, hey, we're going to work on this together and we're going to try and put a stop to those things that we feel are not going to be workable. We're going to talk in far more detail, with far more authority perhaps, than we have in the past about from Wellington what we need for this infrastructure in order to roll out the sort of housing that we need for the future. So thank you, Mr. Chair, thank you to the officers, and may I just close on a sincere thanks to all of the volunteers, all of the people, you know, amongst our staff that weren't just doing their jobs, but they were also helping out at welfare stations and the like as we tried to work our way through this. So we owe it to them that this step today is the first step in trying to get it right and in trying to work together. And so thank you all very much.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Stewart.
Thank you for that. A lot's actually been said, but I just want to pick up on something that Councillor Turner was talking about, and that some areas can work, and the Greenfield area of Stonefields, that's one area that has worked, and I think Councillor Baker has also talked about what's happening out at Jury, that's a Greenfields area that could work, but my concern is back in, like a broken record, back in 2000, 2004, had a moratorium in a big part of Haugen Pakuranga, and one of the streets where there's been 17 apartments being built, where there's only 2 houses, that was an area that was really, really flooded. Howick was very, very lucky this time round. We didn't get flooded, we didn't get the intense rainfall. Just picking up on what Councillor Ferry was saying about councillors around the table, a lot of us around the table who'd supported the unitary plan and the Plan Change 78, well, I can certainly promise that it's something that I haven't supported, and we've got people out in our communities, as Councillor Fletcher was saying, that are really, really struggling at the moment, and they're really concerned that we're allowing all this intensification to happen. The government has to really think long and hard, and they have to put a stop to this, because a lot of these properties will end up being flooded.
picking up on what Councillor Leone was saying about 100-year floods, well, they're really becoming like every year or every second year, or even in some instances over in Australia, they're happening monthly. And so things have changed, and I think we have to be really, really careful, and I think the government needs to really, really, really put a hold on this Plan Change 78, because we're going to all suffer the consequences later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. And just briefly from me, this is a wide scope to deal with what was a catastrophic climate disaster for our city. It was potentially the worst disaster we've had as a city and as a country until 2 weeks later, when we had the horrendous impacts of the cyclone, which then superseded the size of what we experienced. So we're seeing that we need to act quickly. This is not just about Plan Change 78, it's about a broad look at all the tools, all the decisions we've made and can made around what we can do in these situations. But it is important to recognise in places where it didn't flood, say Northcote, there was a lot of opposition to intensification there. The only reason we could get flood mitigation in that area, working with mana whenua, opening up the old streams, was because of the intensification. It paid for that new infrastructure. So there has got to be a balance here on how we address this. In 2006, Tokyo opened their flood mitigation underground. If you've seen the city rail link, it's about 15 times the size of that. That cost $2 billion in 2006, and they still flood. So our stormwater systems, by all councils over many years, were only built for 1 in 10-year floods. So we're getting 1 in 150, 1 in 200-year floods. Our stormwater systems are not funded for this. So if we are wanting to fund infrastructure at the level of risk of a catastrophic event we had, we're going to have to increase the rates, increase funding, increase debt, all those things that people talk about not liking. Well, that's what these councils have done for 30 years, and that's why our infrastructure has gone backwards. The only way you can get more money focused on one place or more infrastructure is more intensification. So we're going to have to look at where the best places are to intensify, because people are still coming. 3 houses next to each other take up a lot more impervious space than 3 on top of each other. So we're going to look at our discussions around car parking. People want more car parking. We've got Hurstmere Road in Takapuna, which didn't flood. We had pushbacks. We removed car parks to put rain gardens in. Those rain gardens saved all those shops and those residences, but we had to remove some car parks to provide those spaces. So it's always going to be a trade-off. It is not just about yes or no. This is what this will do. We'll look at the wide-reaching, the fact we had 5 or 6 times a normal month's in January's rainfall within about 6 hours. This is not normal, but unfortunately we are going to see more of this with climate change. And we've all been saying this, many of us have been saying this. People have scoffed at our action on climate change. We have to play our part on both mitigation and adaptation. This will do this. We will need help from community. We will need help from government. I've spoken to ministers about manage retreat, how that could work. That won't be a fast process, and we can't afford to be buying entire streets, cliffed areas, and buying people out, because the areas in my ward that flooded terribly were built in the 80s and 90s and built hard up against concrete culverts, which we wouldn't do now. But what do we do in the meantime to give people the confidence to reduce the anxiety and deal with that? So I don't want the focus to just be on Plan Change 78. It has to be far broader. What we will do on Plan Change 78 is ensure we have all the evidence that we saw that has affected our communities to back up our qualifying matters on floodplains and everything else. But mana whenua and others have been saying this to us for decades. Why are you building there? Bring back our streams. Stop removing trees. Make sure the water can go where it was supposed to go. But no, for decades we've paved over everything, for car parks, for roads, for highways, and all those things flooded. I think on that night, about 4 or 5 p.m, every single motorway was closed. Because they all used to be beachfronts and they also all used to be rivers. We cannot control water in those levels, so we need to know how we can adapt our city while also reducing our emissions, both of which we've not done, and we're not funding that in this budget. We're actually cutting back a lot of that. So we're all going to have to step up and do this. We can't just keep pointing the finger at others, but this is a significant piece of work, but it needs to be quick, because we need those answers for our communities. But it won't be easy and it will be expensive. So all those in favour? Anyone opposed? No, perfect. So sorry everyone that this has taken us way over lunchtime, especially for our staff. We will take 40-minute break for lunch, and we will come back. Well, everyone has to leave the room for to find some lunch. Thank you. So we come back at 2:25.
Your neighbour.
Come on, man, you get paid enough to.